Quick intro. I'm Cohen, and I'm a game developer who finished his studies in 2022. A part of graduating is also having done a successful internship and to start applying to places us students need a portfolio. Now, my background is that of an all-rounder, so I showed a variety of things, but what I was most proud of was my programming ability for gameplay features. I presented this with the Conductor, a project that served as a final test for Game Design 3. For this class, 4 different prototypes had to be created over the course of 8 weeks, after which the student had to choose one of them to expand upon. I decided to go with this. A simple gameplay mechanic of slapping objects with your left or right hand, giving the hit objects a color, after which the player can clap his hands, which will make said objects fly towards or away from each other. Expanding it, I decided to add a ranged throwing feature, as well as a new special ability. And finally, I made this tower-like structure for the player to ascend, with some very simple enemies placed about. The core of its design was a game that no two people would tackle the same way by giving them the freedom to choose their own methods. Next, some time passes. I continue to work at my internship's place, but that chapter would also inevitably come to an end. Me wanting to update my portfolio thinks that the Conductor is not representative anymore of my gameplay programming and design skills. I want to show better things. So I had a thought. What if I overhauled the project whilst logging its development, showcasing my methods as well as problem-solving skills? And now we're here, my first devlog. To start with, I needed to iron out the wrinkles in the game's core design. First of all, melee became very obsolete once throwing was added. I gave the player a method that far outshone another one in its effectiveness. 2. Repelling objects of the same color feels a lot worse than attracting them. Seeing things fly towards one another and clashing just had way more oomph to it. Number 3, the special ability is just fun, and I want to do it more often, or design more around it. There are of course many other issues in the game like its difficulty, simplicity of AI and balancing, but for now I simply want to focus on what the player can do and how they do things. I brainstormed some, wrote down ideas, and cherry-picked the ones that I felt were most possible to create within a relatively short time frame. Rather than slap and throw objects, the player will now shoot away the fingers on their hands. Said fingers charging the objects that they hit. These fingers could also be recalled, and in my mind this had to be the bread and butter of the gameplay. Merely shooting and recalling the fingers had to feel good and be fun. Clapping would still be a feature and cause objects to be attracted to a centroid, a calculated middle between the charged objects. I decided to leave my brainstorming there as continuing to expand the idea would feel more natural after having created this base. I started with the creation of the hands. It is very much possible for me to start with the programming of the mechanic without any art assets. However, I feel having actual animated hands, even for a prototype, to be crucial in deciding the fun factor and gameplay feeling that I want to create. I hope that made sense. After modeling a very simple hand, I suddenly had to think of its composition. If I want to shoot the fingers, then that means they can be a part of the same mesh as the hand, at least to my knowledge of know-how. I proceeded to rig the palm and each finger separately, after which I also created some animations that I required for my new ideas. I import a full hand into Unity and attempt to make its animations work properly. At this point, I also started coding something that I should not have done: states and state machines. For those unaware, this is a design pattern by which programmers can write clean and optimized code. Now my mistake was thinking that I should create a plethora of states and machines right from the get-go to instantly have clean code and structure to my project. Problem being that it took way longer than expected to get my logic working within the states and machines that I created. I ended up scrapping the states and started with prototype code with which I could quickly implement the base features. I will simply attempt to keep my code clean and readable, even if I'm not following a design pattern. Regardless, when prototyping a first version of anything, you should simply not start with a gargantuan script infrastructure, as it will get you just nowhere. Eventually, I managed to get to the shooting of the fingers with the appropriate animations playing. I'll also say that I have a tendency to write a lot of pseudocode and comments before actually programming things. I think it helps me stay focused, especially if I divvy up what I have to do in multiple steps. The next thing I fixed was the act of charging an object and the finger being stuck in place when it hits, as well as clapping activating the magnetic effect. As you can see, it's still very bare bones. Now next up was a fun challenge. The act of returning the fingers after clapping. Just like how reloading animations can make a gun feel that much better to use, I really wanted to create a good feeling with the fingers moving back to their respective positions. First off, I thought that returning them in an arc would be far better than a straight line. This instantly greatly increased the difficulty of the assignment, yet I wasn't dissuaded. Good thing I know of a very useful free asset in the Unity asset store, the Bezier Path Creator, created by Sebastian Lagu? I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. This asset makes it very easy to create a curve between 2 or more points, even at runtime. There's just one tiny issue I instantly had to double check, and that was its load on the CPU. Not that there were any visible signs of lag during playtime, but it was very much visible in the profiler. At the moment, it's not causing me any problems, but if I start adding more things to this project, each potentially increasing its load, then making sure each of those is optimized becomes all the more important. It's also just a good habit. I initially attempted to reduce this load by reducing the amount of vertices that make up the curves. This, however, did not really influence it, which somewhat confuses me still. Next up, I decided to update only one path every frame, rather than each path. This causes slight incorrections in the paths the fingers will take to the hand, but are so small and honestly barely noticeable. I also checked the time it took to execute specific blocks of code and noticed that the very first time I run the logic, it is considerably slower than all the subsequent runs within the same gameplay session. This, I believe, wasn't something I could change, so to avoid a great performance spike during the gameplay, I now run this logic once on the very first frame of the gameplay, making the first time you actually return a finger be just as performant as the next. Another useful thing with this asset is that it comes with pre-built logic, allowing objects to travel along the Bezier path that it creates, which is exactly what I was looking for. When returning the fingers to their hands, I also needed to keep in mind that it's very much possible for the player to be facing away from the fingers they shot. If they returned them as such, they would simply penetrate the player model and seemingly instantly appear on the hand. To avoid this, every path is actually created with 3 points. A starting point where the finger hits something, the end point where it needs to arrive in its respective finger slot, and finally a middle third point, an invisible location X distance ahead of the player's hand. This makes it so a finger will always appear in front of the player when returning them. I moved the hands to better positions, and that's where I was satisfied with the feeling and general design of the fingers returning to the player. Next in line was adding some player movement. Some basic movement was added, which also made me notice that the hands were still very static objects. There was no real feedback being given to them regarding how I'm moving the character. I initially simply had them lerp to a desired position, but this caused some horrible jittering, and it was a shoddy job, honestly. Since I had already worked so much with the rigid bodies in this project for its physics and gameplay, I decided to try and use the closely adjacent Unity joints. With a little bit of experimentation, it was clear that a fully configurable joint was what I wanted. It was created quite quickly, and I think it does the job well. Now comes a string of tweaks and changes that are almost all aimed at improving how the feature plays. First off, objects that would be sent towards the centroid would be frozen in place when arriving at said centroid, after which a force sends them away, similar to an explosion. This is somewhat mimicking the special ability from the original project. It was also made clear to me that I would have to make some adjustments to the drag of charged rigid bodies, as I previously set the drag to 0, so these objects can fly to the centroid unbothered by friction. Now I could see that I would have to create logic to revert their drag to a default value, or else everything the player hits will end up skating around like they're on ice. An additional impact force from a finger hitting an object was also added at this point. At the same time, I also implemented some basic particles to highlight the paths charged objects would take towards a centroid. Finally, it was some variable tweaking to make the whole thing just feel that much better. Next up, I imported yet another asset, the all-in-one VFX toolkit, so I could add some flair to what I'm doing without spending too much time creating shaders or particles. I proceeded to make the explosion more impactful by shrinking the centroid when charged objects arrive at it. This did create a little bug that caused the fingers to sometimes also get scaled down due to them still being stuck on the object as it's shrinking. Not a difficult bug to fix. Some basic sounds were implemented as well. There's obvious hiccups here and there, but even just having some sounds be there for gameplay makes it feel a lot better. Lastly, I wanted to realize another feature that I call the inverse discharge. This would be a mini explosion that happens when the player decides to shoot a charged object with a finger originating from a different hand than the one used to charge said object. For this, I also used one of the pre-made particles from the VFX asset to give the visual indication of a tiny explosion. A final sound addition, and voila! And that's where I'll conclude part 1 of this project. I will make a WebGL build of this prototype and upload it on itch, so feel free to try it out and share your thoughts. The link will be down below in the description. There will undoubtedly be bugs in it, many of which I potentially already know about, but simply haven't bothered to fix yet. I have more ideas for this project and plan to expand upon it in due time, but this is where I close the curtains for now, as I've got other things to tend to. That being said, I'm pretty satisfied with how I've transformed a school project into something more refined, both design-wise and code-wise. I hope this was somewhat interesting for some of you. This was my very first attempt at making a devlog-like video, and I can definitely see myself try to make more of these. Thanks for watching.